What's up everyone and welcome back to the World History channel. Before we begin, please hit the subscribe button today. Let's get started. Medieval literature. Medieval literature is defined broadly as any work written in Latin or the vernacular between c. 476-1500, including philosophy, religious treatises, legal texts, as well as works of the imagination. More narrowly, however, the term applies to literary works of poetry, drama, romance, epic prose, and histories written in the vernacular, though some histories were in Latin. It is important to keep in mind that many histories of the Middle Ages contain elements of myth, fable, and legend and, in some instances, were largely the creations of imaginative writers. Although it may appear odd to include histories alongside fiction, language, and audience, literary works were originally composed in Latin, but poets began writing in vernacular, the common language of the people, as early as the 7th century. Vernacular literature was further popularized in Britain in the Kingdom of Wessex by Alfred the Great r. 871-899 in an attempt to encourage widespread literacy, and other regions then followed suit. Medieval vernacular literature evolved from the folktale, probably with the storyteller acting out different parts before an audience. The Norman conquest of 1066 established French as the language of literature and transformed the English language from Old English in UC 500-1100 to Middle English c. 1100-1500. The stories written during both these eras were originally medieval folklore, tales transmitted orally, and since most of the population was illiterate, books continued to be read out loud to an audience. The oral aspect of literature, therefore, affected the way it was composed. Writers wrote for a performance of their work, not a private reading in solitude. Literacy rates rose during the 15th century, and with the development of the printing press, more books became available. The act of reading by oneself for personal pleasure became more common, and this changed the way writers wrote. Thomas Malory's Le Morte d'Arthur, written 1469, published 1485, is the earliest novel in the West, a work written for an individual audience with layers of personal meaning and symbolism, and set the foundation for the development of the novel as recognized in the present day. Early development. Medieval vernacular literature evolved naturally from the folktale, which was a story recited, probably with a storyteller acting out different parts, before an audience. Medieval English literature begins with Beowulf's 7th-10th century, which was no doubt a story known much earlier and transmitted orally until written down. This same pattern of development holds for the literature of other countries as well. The storyteller would gather an audience and perform his or her tale, usually with variations based on the audience, and members of that audience would then retell the story to others. Although the majority of early written medieval literature consists of legends or folktales written down on paper rather than recited, the author still needed to gather and hold an audience, so he or she wrote in the vernacular to be understood and in poetic meter to be remembered. Poetry, with its regular cadence, sticks in the mind far better than prose. Poetry would remain the preferred medium for artistic expression throughout most of the Middle Ages. Latin prose was only read by religious and academic audiences, with the exception of a few exceptional examples. For entertainment and escape from one's daily life, people listened to a storyteller read from a good book of verse. Of course, lyric poetry, ballads, and hymns were all forms of poetry. However, epics and the French and Breton lays, short story poems, as well as the great chivalric romances of courtly love and the high medieval dream vision genres, were also written in verse. Initially, medieval writers were anonymous scribes setting down stories they had heard. In the Middle Ages, as in the ancient world, originality in writing was not high on the list of cultural values, and early authors did not sign their works. The actual names of many of the most famous writers of the Middle Ages are still unknown. Marie de France is not the actual name of the woman who wrote the famous lays, it is a pen name, and Chrétien de Troyes name translates from the French as a Christian of Troyes, which could refer to almost anyone. It was not until the 13th and 14th centuries that authors began writing under their own names. Whether known or anonymous, however, these writers created some of the greatest works of literature in history. Other forms of literature. Other forms of literature besides poetry included drama, histories, fables, Drama in the Middle Ages was essentially a teaching tool of the Church. Morality plays, mystery plays, and liturgical plays all instructed an illiterate audience in acceptable thought and behavior. Passion plays, reenacting the suffering, crucifixion, and resurrection of Jesus Christ, were popular Easter entertainments, but morality plays were presented year-round. The best known of these is Every Man c. 1495, which tells the story of a man facing death who cannot find anyone to accompany him to heaven except his good deeds. This allegory grew out of an earlier Latin type of literature known as the ars moriendi, art of dying, which instructed people on how to live a good life and be assured of heaven. Histories in the early Middle Ages 4761000 frequently rely on fable and myth to round out and develop their stories. The works of historians like Gildas 500–570, Bede 673–735, and Nennius 9th century in Britain all contain mythic elements and present fables as true. Geoffrey of Monmouth's Latin-language History of the Kings of Britain, written in 1136, is the most well-known illustration of this. Geoffrey claimed to be translating an ancient historical work he recently discovered, when in fact he was making most of his history up out of his own imagination, and pieces in older actual histories which lent themselves to the tale he wanted to tell. Geoffrey of Monmouth is regarded as the father of the Arthurian legend, because his grand vision of the early British kings was largely based on the heroic Arthur's story. Fables almost always featured anthropomorphized animals as characters in relaying some moral lesson, satirizing some aspect of humanity, or encouraging a standard of behavior. The most popular and influential cycle of fables were those featuring Reynard the Fox 12th century onwards, whose adventures frequently brought him into conflict with Isengrim the Wolf. Reynard is a trickster who relies on his wits to get him out of trouble or to gain some advantage. In one tale, How Reynard Fought Isengrim the Wolf, Isengrim challenges Reynard to a fight to the death to win the favor of the king. Reynard seeks assistance from his aunt because he is aware that he cannot win but cannot refuse. She shaves off all his fur and coats him in slick fat, and he winds up winning because the wolf cannot get hold of him. The fable comes to an end with the king praising Reynard. As with most fables, the underdog comes out a winner against overwhelming odds, and this theme made the tales of Reynard the Fox, and other similar characters, immensely popular. Poetic forms and famous works. Even so, the most popular and influential works were the stories told in verse. The earliest poem in English, whose author is known, is Cædmon's hymn 7th century, which is a simple hymn praising God composed by an illiterate shepherd who heard it sung to him in a vision. His song was written down in Old English by an unnamed scribe at Whitby Abbey, Northumbria, and first recorded in the writings of Bede. The simple beauty of this early verse became the standard of Old English poetry, as evident in works like The Dream of the Rood, a 7th century dream vision, and later The Battle of Maldon, late 10th century. Between these two works, the epic masterpiece Beowulf was written, which relies on the same cadence of the alliterative long line rhythm to move the story forward and impress the tale upon an audience. This verse form resonates in the present day as well as it must have in the past, since recitations and performances of Beowulf remain popular. The story is the epic tale of the lone hero facing down and defeating the dark monster that threatens the people of the land, a theme perennially popular from ancient times to the present day. The poems that Crétin wrote about the brave knight and the damsel in distress gained a lot of popularity and helped shape the myth of King Arthur. A later French work, The Song of Roland 11th century, is another epic which explores the same theme. In the French work, however, the monster is given the human form of the Saracens threatening Christian lives and culture. Roland, the great knight of Charlemagne, is finally tasked with guarding the pass of Roncevaux against the advancing enemy. He gives his life to defend the king, his country, and his companions from the invading forces. The poem was so popular it is said to have been sung by the Norman troops at the Battle of Hastings in 1066 to boost morale. Romances, which became quite popular with the European aristocracy, began to flourish in the 12th century in southern France. Crétin de Troyes, c. 1130–1190, poet of the court of Marie de Champagne L. 1145–1198, is the best known of the Romantic poets and certainly among the most influential. Cretine's poems about the damsel in distress and the brave knight who must rescue her became quite popular, and contributed to the development of the legend of King Arthur and his Knights of the Round Table, which would finally be fully realized by Malory. The romance genre, whether given in poetry or prose, relies on the audience's acceptance of the concept that true love can never last or is unattainable. At the end of the story, one or both of the lovers die or must part. The concept of a happily ever after ending, popular in medieval folklore, rarely concludes a written medieval romance. According to some scholars, this is because the romantic literature of courtly love was a cleverly coded scripture of the Cathars, a heretic religious sect persecuted by the medieval church. The Cathars, pure ones from the Greek kathari, claimed they were the true faith and venerated a feminine divine principle named Sophia Wisdom, who bore a number of similarities to the Virgin Mary. According to the scholarly theory regarding the Cathars and the medieval romance, the damsel in distress is Sophia, and the brave knight is the Cathar adherent who must protect her from danger. The Church. Two of the most powerful women of the Middle Ages, Marie de Champagne and her mother Eleanor of Aquitaine c. 1122-1204, were both associated with the Cathar heresy and both patronesses of writers of the romances such as Cretine de Troyes, Andreas Capellanus, and most likely Marie de France, so there is some historical support for the theory. Whether the romances were allegorical works, their elevation of women in the fictive worlds of the chivalric hero influenced the way women were perceived, at least in the upper classes in everyday life. The genre was developed further in the 12th and 13th centuries by poets such as Robert de Boron, Berulle, and Thomas of Britain, and the great German artists Wolfram von Eschenbach L. 1170-1220 and Gottfried von Strassburg L. c. 1210, who all contributed significant aspects to the Arthurian legend. By the time of the 14th century, however, the medieval view of woman as property had been largely replaced by the novel concept of woman as individual, famously exemplified by Geoffrey Chaucer in the character of the wife of Bath in the Canterbury Tales. Women appear in Cretine's works as strong individuals in the 12th century, most famously the character of Guinevere in the poem Lancelot or the Knight of the Cart, but the wife of Bath is much more rounded and complete individual, who owes her composition as much to the French fabliaux, a short story told in verse, as to the romances or figures from folklore. The elevation of womanhood reached its apex in the poetry of Petrarch L. 1304-1374, whose sonnets to the persona of Laura continue to resonate in the modern day. Petrarch's work was so popular in his time that it influenced social perceptions not only of women but of humanity in general, which is why he is often cited as the first humanist author. While the romances entertained and edified, another genre sought to elevate and console: the high medieval dream vision. Dream visions are poems featuring a first-person narrator who relates a dream which corresponds to some difficulty they are experiencing. The most famous of these is The Pearl by an unknown author, Piers Plowman by William Langland, and Chaucer's Book of the Duchess, all from the 14th century. The genre usually relies on a framing device by which a reader is presented with the narrator's problem, is then taken into the dream, and is then brought back again to the narrator's waking life. In The Pearl, the narrator is grieving the loss of his daughter, has a dream of her new life in heaven where she is safe and happy, and wakes reconciled to the loss of his precious pearl without a price. The father's grief is relieved by God allowing him to see where his daughter has gone and how she has not ceased to exist but has simply found a new and brighter home. Piers Plowman also reveals the goodness and love of God to the dreamer, a man named Will, who is taken on a journey in his dreams in which he meets the good plowman, Piers, who represents Christ and who teaches him how to better live his life. Chaucer's Book of the Duchess, his first major long poem, c. 1370, departs from the religious theme to focus on grief and loss and how one lives with it. In this work, the narrator's true love has left him and he has been unable to sleep for years. He is reading a book about two lovers who have been separated by death when he falls asleep and dreams that he meets a black knight in the woods. The black knight tells him about his own true love, how happy they were together, and then how sad he is that his wife has died. The poem explores a central question of the courtly love romances. Was it better to lose a lover to death or infidelity? The narrator never answers the question. When he wakes from the dream, he only tells the reader he was so amazed by it that he will write it down as a poem. He leaves it up to the reader to answer the question. The medieval dream vision reaches its greatest height in Dante Alighieri's Divine Comedy 14th century, in which the poet is taken on a journey through hell, purgatory, and paradise in order to correct the path he was on and assure him of the truth of the Christian vision. The Divine Comedy is not an actual dream vision. The narrator never claims he has fallen asleep, or that the events are a dream, but Dante draws on the trappings of the genre to tell his story. So closely does the Divine Comedy mirror the progression, tone, and effect of the high medieval dream vision that contemporaries and even Dante's own son interpreted the piece as a dream. Conclusion. Although poetry continued as a popular medium in the late Middle Ages, more writers began working in prose, and among these were a number of notable women. Female Christian mystics such as Julian of Norwich L. 1342-1416 and Catherine of Siena L. 1347-1380 both related their visions in prose, and Marjorie Kemp L. 1373-1438 dictated her revelations to a scribe who recorded them in prose. One of the most famous writers of the Middle Ages, Christine de Pisanel 1364-1430, wrote her highly influential works in prose, as did the great Italian artist Giovanni Boccaccio L. 1313-1375, best known for his masterpiece, the Decameron. From the 12th century on, the Arthurian legend was written down in prose in the Vulgate cycle between 1215 and 1235, followed by an edited version in the post-Vulgate cycle between 1240 and 1250, which was the basis for Malory's work. Malory's Le Morte d'Arthur codified the Arthurian legend, which was then enhanced and reworked by later writers, and continues to exert influence in the present day. Although scholars continue to debate precisely which work should be considered the first novel in English, Malory's work is always a strong contender. William Caxton, Malory's publisher, was one of the first to benefit from the new printing press invented by Johannes Gutenberg c. 1440. Gutenberg's press ensured that medieval literature, largely anonymous and free to whomever wanted to publish it, would survive to influence later generations of readers. Medieval literature is defined broadly as any work written in Latin or the vernacular between c. 476 and 1500, encompassing philosophy, religious treatises, legal texts, and imaginative works. More specifically, the term often applies to literary creations such as poetry, drama, romance, epic prose, and vernacular histories, though even some Latin histories were deeply imaginative, blending myth, fable, and legend with factual accounts. The Middle Ages often blurred the line between fiction and reality, giving birth to works that served both entertainment and ideological purposes. In the early medieval world, Latin dominated written texts, particularly in ecclesiastical and scholarly circles, but by the 7th century, authors began turning toward vernacular languages to reach broader audiences. Leaders like Alfred the Great of Wessex, who promoted literacy and encouraged writing in the common tongue and laid the groundwork for vernacular literary traditions throughout Europe, helped to accelerate this shift. Medieval vernacular literature evolved naturally from oral storytelling. Folk tales, passed from generation to generation, were acted out by storytellers who would adapt the narrative to suit their audience. This tradition continued even as tales were committed to parchment, and most people remained illiterate. As a result, literature retained a significant auditory component because it was intended to be performed and heard rather than read aloud. The Norman conquest of 1066 introduced French as the new language of aristocratic and literary life in England, transforming Old English into Middle English. Despite French influence, Middle English emerged as a vibrant literary form in its own right. The advent of the printing press in the 15th century and rising literacy allowed for a cultural shift. Literature became increasingly personal, and the act of solitary reading changed how authors wrote. Works like Thomas Malory's Le Morte d'Arthur, penned in 1469 and published in 1485, reflect this transition, with complex layers of symbolism and introspective themes, representing early developments in the novel form. Early development of medieval literature follows a pattern familiar across cultures. In England, Beowulf, 7th to 10th century, marked a beginning, though the tale likely existed in oral form long before being written. This pattern was global. Oral traditions formed the backbone of medieval storytelling everywhere. As these stories were transcribed, the challenge was to preserve their rhythm and accessibility. As a result, poetry dominated due to its mnemonic and cadence qualities. Verse stuck in the memory far more effectively than prose and became the primary medium of storytelling. Lyric poetry, ballads, hymns, epics, and French and Breton lays, short narrative poems, all flourished. Chivalric romances, courtly love poetry, and dream vision allegories were primarily composed in verse, crafted not for private reading but for communal listening. Initially, medieval writers rarely claimed authorship. Scribes merely recorded tales, often without concern for originality. Reusing well-known tales, sometimes embellishing them or giving them local significance, was creative thinking. Many famous writers from the medieval period remain anonymous. Even known names like Marie de France and Chrétien de Troyes may be pseudonyms or vague references. It wasn't until the 13th and 14th centuries that writers began openly claiming authorship. Regardless of anonymity, these early creators laid the foundation for European literature, influencing generations. Beyond poetry, medieval literature encompassed drama, histories, and fables. Church-sponsored drama, morality plays, mystery plays, and liturgical performances educated illiterate populations on Christian doctrine and ethical living. Passion plays during Easter dramatized Christ's suffering and resurrection, while morality plays like Everyman, circa 1495, allegorized human life, death, and salvation. These plays came from the literature known as ars moriendi, or the art of dying, which taught believers how to die well and get to heaven. Medieval histories were not modern histories. Early writers like Gildas c. 500 to 570, Bede 673 to 735, and Nennius 9th century, wove legends and mythology into their narratives. The most dramatic example is Geoffrey of Monmouth, whose History of the Kings of Britain, 1136, combined dubious ancient sources with wild imagination. Claiming to translate a lost manuscript, Geoffrey created a fantastical history centered around King Arthur, setting the stage for centuries of Arthurian literature. Geoffrey is often called the father of the Arthurian legend, because his vision redefined British heroic myth.